The mud sucked at boots and wheels alike, thick and clinging like the desperation in the air. Rain had come and gone the night before, leaving behind a stew of manure, spilled beer, and forgotten promises. The clearing just outside the saloon, where the pine woods bowed to the will of axes and smoke, had become the unofficial stage for auctions of the living kind-eaters, drunks, widows who had outlived their usefulness, and the occasional nameless soul whose silence could be bought cheaper than salt. A makeshift platform of creaking planks stood crooked at the center, flanked by 2 rusting oil lamps and the town's auctioneer, a thin man with a crooked nose and a voice sharp as pine needles. His boots were caked in mud and his words reeked of whiskey. "Next up," he shouted, lifting one arm as if introducing royalty. "A real mystery prize. Don't talk, don't scream, don't fight. Maybe she's dumb, maybe she's holy, maybe both. Comes with her own sack." Laughter rippled through the small crowdmen in stained coats, boys too young to be watching, and women with their mouths tight shut. The woman on the platform didn't flinch. She stood barefoot, her wrists bound in front with a frayed length of hemp. The burlap sack over her head was stained and wet in places. She said nothing, not even as a boy in the front row threw a small stone that hit her hip with a dull thwack. "Come on now," the auctioneer smirked. "No takers. She can cook, I bet. Clean, maybe. Could be a mute, could be a witch. Hell, she's breathing, and that's more than I can say for my last wife." A few chuckles, but no bids. The woman's chest rose and fell in slow, measured rhythm, a breath trying not to be noticed. At the edge of the crowd, beneath the half-shadow of a charred pine, a man shifted his weight. Broad-shouldered, coat frayed at the seams, and boots worn nearly flat, Elias Granger didn't look like much to anyone but the trees. Sawdust still clung to the wool of his jacket, and his beard was uneven, like it had grown while he forgot to care. His face was quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something had once been loud, and never would be again. He raised 2 fingers. The crowd turned. The auctioneer squinted. "What's that, Granger? You bidding or waving flies?" $2, Elias said flatly. A beat passed, then the laughter burst. $2? For the scarecrow? One man hollered. Another slapped his knee. "Hell, I'll throw in a shovel so you can bury her decent when she keels over." Elias didn't blink, didn't smile. His finger stayed up. The auctioneer looked from the crowd to Elias, shrugged like a man who'd seen worse trades go through. "Sold," he barked, and spit into the mud. To the woodsman, with low standards and lower judgment. The woman still didn't move. Elias stepped forward. Someone called out, "You want her name, you'll have to carve it yourself." He ignored them. Reaching the platform, he paused beside her and untied the rope binding her hands. She didn't pull away. He didn't remove the sack. Instead, he put a folded blanket into her hands, turned, and walked. She followed. The trail sloped upward, narrow and wet, carving through pine trees that bent under the weight of moss and memory. The air smelled of bark, damp soil, and the bite of distant snow. The kind of quiet settled in that made a man hear his own thoughts whether he wanted to or not. Elias Granger walked ahead, steady as a mule, with the hooded woman trailing just a pace behind. Her bare feet left broken prints in the mud, toes curling with each careful step. Her arms hung close to her body, bound no longer by rope, but by something far heavier. The burlap sack still covered her face. He hadn't taken it off. Not because he feared what lay beneath, but because he figured a woman might need to keep her shape for a while, whatever shape that was. A thing becomes armor if worn long enough. Midway up the trail, her foot caught a hidden root, and she stumbled forward. Elias turned quick, caught her under the arms before she hit the ground. Her breath hitched, not quite a gasp. Just a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around herself. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. He set her upright, steadied her, and walked on. She followed, silent as snowfall. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had begun to dip, dragging long shadows behind the trees. The structure appeared more like part of the forest than a part from it, wood darkened with age, a roof patched with bark and tin, smoke curling faint from the crooked chimney. No fence, no welcome sign. Just a place built by a man who had no reason to be found. Elias pushed open the heavy door, and it groaned like it remembered every soul who had walked through. Inside, the cabin was spare but solid. One room, one cot, one stove, and a single shelf lined with tools and a Bible that hadn't been touched in years. He pointed to a corner near the hearth where a thick quilt was already laid out. She nodded, just barely, and walked to it like a ghost trying to remember how to sit. Elias knelt by the stove and stirred the coals. The fire glowed to life again with reluctant warmth. He added a log, stood, and hung his coat on a bent nail near the door. Then he turned back and looked at her. She hadn't moved. He crossed the room, knelt beside her, and with careful fingers began to loosen the knot at her wrists. She did not resist. The skin underneath was red and raw, the kind of damage that didn't bleed but stung for days. Once the rope was gone, he sat back on his heels, rubbed his hands together, and let out a long breath. "I don't want a servant," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Or a ghost, just someone who don't scream in the dark." She didn't reply, didn't nod, just folded her hands into her lap and kept her head bowed. Elias stood, took a tin cup from the shelf, filled it with clean water from the jug, and set it beside her on the floor. "Drink when you're ready," he said. Then he picked up his own blanket roll, laid it across from the hearth on the opposite wall, and lowered himself to the floor with the ease of a man used to sleeping on wood. The fire crackled. Outside, a coyote howled once and then went quiet. Inside, the silence didn't press. It just existed, heavy but not cruel. Neither of them spoke. And that, for now, was enough. Rain came in like a whisper at first, then hit the cabin roof in thick, heavy drops, drumming against the tin patches like someone demanding entry. Elias glanced up from his work table, listening to the wind push through the pines. The fire crackled low in the stove, painting the room in soft amber shadows. Across from it, the woman still lay curled on the blanket he'd set out the night before, her head swathed in the same sackcloth that had cloaked her during the auction. She hadn't moved much. Once, in the gray blush of dawn, he'd seen her adjust her knees, just enough to keep the weight off her hip. But other than that, nothing. Not even a word. Elias had left a folded bundle by her feet before heading out that morning: soft flannel, a loose work shirt, thick woolen socks. Clean, though well worn. On the wooden crate beside her lay a slice of bread and a tin cup of water, beads of condensation forming around its rim. She hadn't touched either, but she knew they were there. He'd caught her fingers grazing the fabric once, when she thought he wasn't looking. A gust rattled the shutters. Elias rose from his bench and checked the latch, tightening the beam across the door. The storm was rolling in fast, seeing the black bellies of the clouds gathering just before twilight, curling over the ridge like wolves sniffing weakness. Storms in these parts didn't ask permission. They broke what they pleased. He lit the lantern hanging from the rafter, its flame flickering uncertainly before finding its rhythm. The soft light bled into corners the fire couldn't reach, revealing dust, old tools, and the scars on the floor from boots and dragged furniture. He turned back toward the cot, blade still in his hand, and sat to continue sharpening it. The sound of metal against stone filled the silences low, even the scrape of a man with no reason to hurry. From her place by the stove, she flinched at the sudden screech of wind as it clawed the side of the house. Her body curled tighter. Elias noticed. He didn't speak, just kept honing the knife. Then, faint and fragile, it came. A hum. So quiet, it could have been mistaken for the wind. A thread of melody, muffled by the sack, shaped by lips that hadn't dared to form words in days. The tone was soft, high, hesitant, but steady. Not a song, not fully, just a sound. Like someone trying to remember what peace used to feel like. Elias's hand froze, blade halfway down the stone. The sound stirred something in him, something he had boarded up and buried beneath years of solitude. His late wife had hummed like that. Not often. But sometimes, when the storms rolled in and the roof leaked, and they had nothing but beans and silence to fill the space she'd hum, a little tune without name or purpose. Just to remind the world they were still alive inside it. He didn't turn toward the woman, didn't speak, only let the blade rest beside him and folded his hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the flame in the stove. The hum rose a little, wavered, and settled again like a wounded bird trying its wings. It lasted less than a minute. When it stopped, the silence returned heavy, but somehow changed. He stayed there long after the fire dulled and the lantern sputtered low, listening to the rain, to the hush, to the ghost of a song neither of them knew how to finish. By the time spring reached the ridge, the snow had melted into thick veins that fed the roots, and the pines seemed to breathe again. The ground was still damp, and steam sometimes rose off it in the early hours, like the earth was sighing in its sleep. Birds returned in cautious twos and threes, calling to each other like lovers, afraid to speak too loudly. And in the little clearing around Elias Granger's cabin, the silence began to change. The woman still wore the sack, still slept by the stove, still flinched at thunder and loud knocks of wind against the roof. But she moved differently now, slower, but with intent. She swept the cabin floor using the old broom from behind the door, dragging the bristles in quiet, purposeful strokes. She'd started folding the blankets more neatly, collecting wood chips near the fire pit, arranging the tin dishes on the shelf without being asked. Elias said nothing about it. He simply watched when she wasn't looking. His old hound, Barlow, had once growled low whenever she passed. Now he let her feed him. Once, Elias returned from the woods to find the dog resting his chin on her lap as she sat on the stoop, still hooded, her hand lightly resting between his ears. No words, just stillness. Elias had paused at the tree line, watching that gentle trust form like frost melting off a branch. It startled something inside him, but he said nothing. Not yet. One afternoon, as clouds rumbled like distant drums, and the air turned warm enough to shed a coat, Elias took to splitting logs again. He liked the work swing, crack, stack. Something about it made sense. Each strike answered a question the world hadn't asked. He wiped sweat from his brow with the crook of his arm, letting the axe bite through another round. Behind him, he heard the slow drag of the broom, then footsteps near the cabin door. The hinges creaked when she opened it to shake out a rug, and he made a note to oil them. He swung again. Then heard her steps approach soft, deliberate. He didn't turn, not at first. "I can fix it," she said. The voice barely rose above the wind. It cracked in the middle, dry and papery like something unused for years, but it was unmistakably hers. Elias stopped mid-swing, the axe blade stuck firm in the log, quivering. He turned slowly, blinking into the sun. She stood by the porch, pointing to the cabin door, the hinge where rust had eaten through one of the screws. The sack still hid her face, but not the tremor in her fingers or the effort it took to force those 4 words out. He didn't speak right away, just stared, letting her words hang in the air like wood smoke. Her hand dropped after a moment, folding back into her sleeve. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said quietly. She stepped back inside. Elias pulled the axe free with one smooth motion and set it down by the stack. The trees rustled above him. The storm didn't come, not that day. He stood there for a long time, looking at the door. Then at the woman inside, who had finally let a thread of her voice touch the light. The creek behind the cabin ran quiet, not deep, but clear enough to show the stones beneath smooth, pale things that had survived seasons of ice and flood. Mist curled above the water in the early spring air, catching on reeds and branches like secrets too stubborn to drift away. The trail down from the cabin was narrow, half-choked with bramble, and Elias rarely took it unless something needed cleaning or burying. That morning, the woman stood in the doorway as he fetched water, her fingers clutching the frayed hem of her coat. When he turned to go, she followed a few steps, then paused. "Soap," she said, her voice low but steady. Elias nodded once. He didn't ask why, didn't press. He took the bar from the shelf, pine ash and lard, rough to the touch, and handed it to her. Then he led the way. They reached the creek as sunlight began to slice through the treetops, gold shafts drifting down onto mossy rocks and the edges of melting frost. Elias stopped just before the water, glanced back to her, and gestured to the bank. "I'll stay here," he said, voice gruff but not unkind. Then, true to his word, he turned away, facing the thick pines with hands shoved into his coat pockets. Behind him, he heard her move, the brush of fabric, the soft thump of shoes on wet earth, then the splash-sharp, gasping, water like needles. She didn't cry out, but her breath stuttered, hitched with every moment she stayed in the cold. He stared at the bark in front of him, tried to listen to the wind instead, but it was no use. The sound of her struggle quiet, but raw cut through everything. Then it came, the sound of weeping. Not loud, not broken, just weeping, soft and shaken, like tears were something she'd had to learn how to release. Elias closed his eyes, jaw tightening, not out of anger but helplessness. He had no words to offer her, no prayers left to give. After a while, the sounds stopped. He heard cloth shifting again, the scrape of rock. Then the faint steps approaching. He turned his head slightly as she passed but didn't look fully. He saw only that the sack she wore was soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second face, and darker now in patches. Water dripped from the hem of her dress. She walked ahead of him this time. Back in the cabin, she went straight to the hearth, knelt beside the fire, and laid out her sleeves to dry. She didn't speak. He didn't either. The silence between them had shape now. Not a wall but a shared shelter. That night, after she'd settled beneath her blanket, Elias stood by the shelf. From the small drawer beneath his late wife's hymn book, he pulled a headscarf dark plum with faded roses stitched along the border. It had belonged to someone he'd loved, once. Someone who had worn it on cold mornings when she sang to the chickens and laughed at his sour coffee. He placed it gently on the woman's pillow. In the morning, it was still there untouched, but folded carefully beside the photo frame that held the only image Elias had of the woman buried under the birch cross out back. He said nothing, just poured water for the fire and fed the hound. The scarf stayed there for 3 more days, then it disappeared. And he never asked where it went. The sun dipped low over the ridge, painting the treetops in slow-burning gold, the kind that lingered even after the light was gone. Fireflies blinked into existence, dotting the clearing like sparks held back by breath. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the kind of silence that doesn't ask questions, it waits. The windows were open to let the heat out, and a breeze moved through, carrying the scent of pine and warmed earth. Elias sat by the hearth, legs stretched, knife idle in his lap. The fire had died down to coals, more glow than flame, and he didn't bother to stoke it. Some nights didn't need the heat. Tonight, the warmth came from elsewhere. The sack lay folded neatly on the table. He hadn't seen her take it off, just returned from chopping wood to find it there creased, damp in places, smelling faintly of ash and soap. It sat on the table like a surrendered flag. He looked at it once. Didn't touch it. Just turned and set down the logs without a word. She didn't hide from him anymore, not in the way she used to. That night, she sat across from him on the other side of the fire pit, her legs drawn up, back straight. The scarf he'd left weeks ago was wrapped tight around her hair now, dark against her skin. The firelight caught her cheekbones, the hollows of her face, and the spots where old bruises had faded into memory but not yet into nothing. Her eyes were sharp, haunted, yes but sharp, alive. He didn't stare, just waited, knife still, and hands resting on his thighs. She looked at him for a long time before speaking. "My name is Miriam." The words were soft but certain, like they'd been waiting in the base of her throat all along. She didn't whisper them. She said them as if they deserved air, a full breath. Elias barely breathed. The name struck like a match somewhere deep in his chest, familiar, half forgotten. Miriam, his mother's name, his wife's middle name. The name stitched into a hymn book now buried beneath the orchard that burned. He felt the weight of it settle over the room like dust from a ceiling beam finally breaking. He looked at her then, not startled, just still. "Good name," he said quietly. "No more than that. No need for more." She looked down, hands tightening around her knees. The moment stretched between them, tender but heavy, like a rope that held rather than tied. He picked up the kettle, poured warm water into a tin cup, and handed it to her across the fire. She took it without hesitation this time, fingers brushing his for the first time since she'd come to him. A small spark, unnoticed by the fire but felt between skin and bone. They sat like that, Miriam and Elias, in the kind of quiet that isn't empty, it's shared. Outside, the fireflies blinked like stars trying to remember how to shine. Inside, a name rested in the air, and neither of them needed to ask again. The fire cracked low, its flames curling around the edges of the last log like fingers reluctant to let go. Outside, the wind whispered gently through the trees, stirring the pine needles overhead. Crickets had taken up their usual song, steady and slow, like a lullaby meant only for those who knew how to listen. The stars blinked into the clearing one by one, watching without judgment. Elias sat with his back against a log, boots stretched toward the fire. Miriam was across from him, knees drawn to her chest, a woven shawl draped over her shoulders. She hadn't spoken much that day, but neither had he. They had worked side by side in the garden that morning, her sorting the kindling, him checking the fencing, and then they had both returned to their corners of the silence they'd come to understand. But tonight felt different. Something in the air asked for memory. He looked into the fire like it owed him an answer. Then, after a while, he began to speak, not with preamble, not with drama, just with the weight of something that had waited too long to be shared. "Used to be an orchard," he said, eyes fixed on the flames. "Back beyond the ridge, past the black stump, pears mostly. Some apple, she planted 'em, my wife." He didn't look at Miriam, but he felt her shift slightly, not to interrupt, just to be closer. "Took 3 years for them trees to give anything," he went on. "We fought gophers, frost, everything short of locusts. She named 'em like children, used to talk to 'em, sing to 'em, said they grew sweeter when someone loved them." A smile touched the corner of his mouth, brief, like something borrowed. "I was out trapping the day it happened," he said, and his voice dropped lower. "Saw the smoke from the ridge. Thought maybe it was just the stove. Maybe she burned bread again, but it was more than that." He paused, the fire popped. "Whole house was gone by the time I got there. Just ash. And heat. I found her in the orchard, face down, still had the garden shears in her hand." He reached down, picked up a stick, and stirred the embers. "People said it was lightning, but I never saw a storm. Just smoke. No rain, only loss." Miriam didn't speak, didn't murmur pity or sorrow. She simply sat very still, her arms wrapped around her legs, her eyes holding him like a vessel holds water without spilling it. When Elias finished, he leaned back and rubbed a hand down his face, then stared again into the coals like maybe she'd rise from them if he looked long enough. They didn't speak the rest of the night. But in the morning, he found her at the orchard's edge. She was kneeling in the dirt, palms flat against the soil. The burned stump of the old pear tree stood behind her, charred and hollow, but solid still. In her hand, a tiny pine sprig. She pressed it into the earth with quiet reverence, then cupped the soil around its base like she was tucking in a child. It was the first time he'd seen her touch the earth without trembling. She didn't look back at him, but he stayed by the cabin door, watching. And for the first time in years, the ridge felt like something might grow again. It was just past noon when the dog began to growl low in his throat, ears pinned, body rigid beside the porch steps. Elias looked up from the pile of split wood, sweat already drying on his brow. The sun was hot and lazy overhead, but the wind had stopped, not gone, just stilled, like the trees were holding their breath. A rider came up the trail. Dust clung to his boots and horse alike, and his coat, though neat, bore the scuffs of hard travel. The rifle strapped across his back wasn't for show. Neither was the star pinned to the edge of his vest-worn, dull private issue, not law, hired work. Elias stepped down from the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the door, not yet. The rider slowed, reined in. His horse pawed at the dirt impatiently. "You, Granger?" the man asked, voice smooth like creek stones under water. Elias didn't answer, just looked. The man chuckled. "Reckon you are. Name's Silas Drew. I work out of Bend. Been paid to collect something that passed through these parts." Elias's jaw didn't move. The dog growled again, and he gave a soft click of his tongue to hush it. "I'm looking for a woman," Silas went on. "Came through here last winter. Might have had a sack on her head. Might have been quiet. Real pretty under all that silence." Behind Elias, the cabin door creaked just slightly. He didn't turn. "Story is," Silas continued, dismounting with practiced ease, "she ain't free. Belongs to a private asylum railway baron's little secret. They called her unstable, dangerous. Took a carving knife to one of the orderlies. Killed him, clean through the throat." Elias stepped off the porch, slow, deliberate, boots crunching over gravel. He stood between the bounty hunter and the door, arms loose at his sides. "You bring papers?" Silas smiled without warmth. "Got a bill of claim from the buyer. That's more than you'll get in court." "She's my wife," Elias said, the words coming like river stones breaking the current. "Ain't going anywhere." The lie hung between them, heavy and unmistakable. Behind him, he could feel Miriam at the door, just inside the frame, watching. Silas's smile faded. He scanned the porch, the dog, the rifle resting by the wall. "You don't strike me as the marrying kind. Guess grief changes a man." A pause. The two men watched each other like wolves waiting for a misstep. Finally, Silas exhaled, nodded once. "All right, Granger. Maybe I got the wrong trail." He turned back toward his horse, swung up into the saddle. But before he left, he looked back. Men with lies in their teeth tend to choke on 'em eventually. Might not be me next time. Elias didn't answer. Silas rode off, slow at first, then fast as he hit the slope, kicking up dust like a warning behind him. When the wind returned, it was colder. Miriam stepped onto the porch. She didn't ask what he'd done, or why he'd said it. He looked at her, eyes steady. "You're not going anywhere," he said again. And this time, it was the truth. The cedar tree had stood behind the cabin since before Elias ever laid down his first stone, long before the roof and the hearth and the bed were built by calloused hands. It had survived windstorms, winter rot, even a lightning strike that blackened half its trunk but didn't kill it. That morning, Elias took a hatchet and a carving knife and went to it with something quiet in his heart. Not rage, not duty, something else, something like reverence. He cut a post from the cedar's strongest limb, thick and clean, sanded it down, polished it smooth with oil and cloth until it gleamed like amber in the sunlight. Then he placed it beside the front door, just off the steps where anyone passing, if anyone ever dared, could see it. With the carving knife, he etched her name in slow, deliberate strokes. Miriam. Not large, not crude, just true. When he was done, he stepped back and looked at it. The name fit there like it had always been meant to, not as a mark of possession, but as an anchor, as welcome. Miriam watched from the edge of the clearing, her fingers tight around the edge of her shawl. When Elias turned to go inside, she stayed behind, her eyes fixed on the post. Minutes passed before she moved, walking to it with measured steps. She ran her hand across the carving, her breath catching at the shape of each letter. Then, without a word, She followed him inside. The cabin was still, filled with the scent of fresh cedar and stew simmering on the stove. The dog lay curled in his usual spot, thumping his tail once in greeting. Elias didn't speak. He sat at the table, whittling the end of a broom handle smooth. Miriam stood for a long time in the doorway before she finally came forward and lowered herself into the chair across from him. "I want to tell you," she said. He looked up. Her voice trembled but didn't falter. "The man. The one they say I killed." He nodded once, gave her room. "He was my keeper. Bought me out of a debtor's auction when I was 15. Said I owed his family for my father's wage theft. Said my mother had begged him to take me." She swallowed hard. I believed him. Her hands twisted in her lap, fingers curling like leaves drying in sun. "He locked me in the attic, fed me from a tray like a dog, beat me when I cried, worse when I didn't, and he was powerful. He wore clean boots and spoke in courtrooms. Called me unwell, unstable. Said I spoke to the walls, and when I tried to run, he called it proof." She paused. Her eyes glistened but didn't spill. "I didn't plan to kill him. Not really. I wanted him to stop." The room held her grief like the fire held heat low and pulsing. "No one would have believed me," she whispered. Elias didn't reach for her. Didn't speak the kind of words people put on tombstones or courtroom benches. Instead, he set the broom handle down and opened his palm across the table. "If you want," he said, voice soft as sawdust, "we can start over." She looked at his hand like it was a thing she wasn't sure how to hold. Then, slowly, she placed hers in it. And just like that, the wind shifted through the trees, brushing against the cedar post outside where her name was written for no one but her. Mist drifted through the pines like a breath held too long. It clung to the branches and hung low above the forest floor, curling over roots and rocks as if the woods themselves were exhaling something old. The morning was still. Not silent, exactly birds called in the distance, the wind shifted through needles, but it was a stillness that asked for reverence. The kind of stillness that comes before something sacred. Elias walked beside her without speaking, their boots sinking lightly into the damp earth as they followed the narrow trail to the clearing he had found years ago, when solitude was a shield instead of a wound. He carried nothing but the quiet in his chest. Miriam walked with her hands tucked into her shawl, her hair braided down her back, her pace sure. Neither of them looked back toward the cabin. Not because they were leaving it behind, but because they weren't running from anything anymore. The clearing opened wide beneath the oldest tree in the forest, a great pine whose trunk split into two halfway up, like it had once tried to be two things at once, and learned to live as both. Its roots spread outward in thick, knotted veins, rising just enough from the ground to be felt through the soles of their feet. The tree stood like a witness. They stopped at its base. The mist glowed around them, the air carrying the scent of damp moss and something faintly sweet-early blossom or memory. It was hard to tell. Elias turned to her, cleared his throat once, not out of nerves but because what he was about to say had waited a long time to be said. "Miriam," he said, and her name came out like a promise. "I got no ring, no preacher, no papers. Just this place, my hands, and whatever life I've got left." She watched him, eyes deep and unwavering. "I won't promise I'll be easy, or right, all the time. But I'll carry you beside me, not behind. And I'll never leave you waiting in a locked room." Her eyes softened, a tremble in her lips. Then she stepped forward, lifted her hand to his chest, felt the rhythm there. "Elias," she whispered, "you didn't save me. I saved myself the night I ran. But you built a place where I could land. And I've walked through too much fire to call that anything but home." She looked around the clearing, the branches above them, the soil beneath. "I won't forget who I was," she said, "or what I've done, but I will plant something better over it, with you." He nodded, and for a long moment they just stood there, the wind threading between them like a thread of breath, tying two lives together with nothing but truth and time. Then they kissed. Not hurried, not desperate, just full, like water drawn slowly from a deep, clean well, a kiss that didn't erase the past but honored it. Later, as the fire crackled back at the cabin, the sack that had once covered her head rested in the flames. It curled slowly, smoke drifting upward like a ghost finally let go. No one spoke as it burned. They simply sat side by side, their shoulders touching, eyes fixed on the fire, and the life that would rise from its warmth. No rings, no witnesses, only vows. And the mist above the trees began to lift,